Dear friends, hello. I am indeed very happy to be truly with you for this new report, a report of utmost importance that is nonetheless very rarely covered by the media. Today we are indeed going to actually talk about Lyme borreliosis, also better known as Lyme disease. Lyme, which originates from the town where this disease was first identified in the early 1970s in the United States, specifically in the state of Connecticut. To emphasize the importance of this report, Lyme disease is also called the silent killer, because in reality it kills slowly and gradually, moreover, impacting more and more people. When we say killer, it is not always necessarily fatal, but in any case, the disease develops silently and often unnoticed and can lead to paralysis, severe neurological damage, or joint damage. This disease is largely underdiagnosed and very unknown to the general public. Generally, what is known is that it is linked to a tick bite, and that's about it. But we do not know all the consequences and all the phases of its progression. So the objective of this report is to provide general information, to remain relatively concise, in a popularization approach, but still at a level of information that allows you to understand the issue, to know what to do if you are bitten by a tick, to know how to protect yourself, and if there are a number of symptoms, perhaps who to turn to, or initially, what protocol can be adapted. And in my field of expertise, as you know, I am a naturopath and aromatherapist, and well, in my field of expertise, we already have quite a few things to do with natural substances, whether it be in the realm of phytotherapy, aromatherapy, or even nutritherapy. We already have a number of things to do. So this Lyme disease was not initially intended for human beings. It was originally intended for animals. One could say that humans are merely accidental hosts in the tick's journey, as ticks are hematophagous, meaning they are insects that feed on the blood of their victims. In reality, it is when the tick bites an already contaminated animal that it actually absorbs the bacterium or one of the bacteria. There are actually several, as we will see, into its blood. Once the tick carries this bacterium, it will indeed contaminate another host when it actually bites them. So actually, initially, the tiger primarily feeds on wild animals in the wild and in nature. Initially, very small animals, because depending on the height at which it can settle, if it is in the larval stage, meaning it was born not too long ago, it will tend to bite small animals like shrews, mouse pups, or even rabbits. And then, as it grows in its adult stage, which is a fascinating period of its life, it has the ability to climb to higher heights, reaching places it couldn't before. And if by chance a human is in nature, perhaps hiking or exploring in the forest, or now increasingly in places other than forests, such as urban parks or suburban areas, we can even find it in the gardens of our homes, sometimes hidden among the plants. It can also bite humans, which is a concerning behavior, and potentially infect them if it carries the bacteria, leading to serious health issues. So let's go back a little to the history to understand a bit what is happening. This disease was described at the end of the 19th century in Europe, but it was named Lyme following the appearance of a mysterious case in 1975 in the United States, in Connecticut. In fact, indeed, there was a rather mysterious and quite peculiar case of arthritis, which is known as rheumatoid arthritis, as we will see. Some specific bacteria that are carrying this particular disease tend to have a preference for the joints. And simultaneously, in those years around 1975, there were 39 children and 12 adults who experienced very specific, very debilitating pains. An epidemiological investigation is being conducted. At a certain point in a very small village in Lyme, it is not normal to have such a contaminated population. It is understood that there is a factor at play, because initially the medical authorities were rather in denial, saying, no, we don't understand, it's rheumatism, etc. And at some point, it was in the late 1970s that the connection was made between the tick bite and the infectious trail. Indeed. It was not until the 1980s, specifically in 1982, that the entomologist and bacteriologist Willy Boerdecker, who passed away not too long ago in 2014, a contemporary figure, discovered and published in the renowned and prestigious journal Science the germ responsible for this strange and previously unknown disease. And it will describe, among other things, the possible impacts on the joints and the nervous system. And so for the first time, we indeed truly have the description of this infamous disease. So I won't go into great detail. But there is also a connection with additional scientific experiments that were carried out in this region on possible bacteriological warfare, where research was done to infect blood-sucking insects, including ticks, with mutant bacteria to create these infamous weapons. So unfortunately, the most probable lead, in any case, Willy Boerdefer, would have confessed before dying by saying what I just told you, namely that there were experiments being conducted a few dozen kilometers away by chemists and bacteriologists who were developing these weapons. So the human factor is very likely. But anyway, I'll close this parenthesis. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing to understand is that there are different forms, and the bacteria carried by ticks in the United States, those discovered by Willy Boerdefer, are not the same as the bacteria found in European strains. In fact, there are mutations, there are different selections, and these are not the same bacteria. And this is important. We will come back to it later when I talk about diagnostic methods. So now let's talk a little about the incidence. Are many people affected? Are the statistics we are given reliable? You know, it's a bit like a certain epidemic a few years ago. I will draw some parallels. Unfortunately, you have to seek out the information, and you can't be sure that it is always highly reliable. Among other things, what public health communicates about, so here I am speaking for our country in France, is simply about the prevalence. Prevalence is indeed the fact that there are so many affected people, so many new cases, so many indeed. So today, according to official public health figures, there are 91 cases per 100,000 inhabitants, which would roughly estimate to about 60,000 new cases. But what we can say is that this estimate is largely underestimated. First, because there is no adequate and comprehensive training in the medical and healthcare field, starting with doctors. Therefore, many doctors miss the diagnosis. And I can personally testify, I have had many patients affected by this who have been in medical limbo. They tell me for many years because no one knew what they had. We thought it was rheumatism. We thought when it was neurological diseases, even psychosomatic ones. And in addition, what you need to know is that there is essentially no reporting obligation. So Lyme borreliosis is not among the diseases that require mandatory reporting. Today, what we can say is that general practitioners, according to the Sentinel Network, which monitors this vigilance, tell us that approximately 2.3% of doctors have the proper training to clinically detect and have accurate figures. So first, we are talking about prevalence, that is, new cases, not the total cases, so we will need to add them up to get the official figures, probably affecting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people at different stages, but we are likely dealing with a significant case. In the United States, we are talking about millions rather than hundreds of thousands of people, which shows the significance. The goal of this report is not to scare you, but to raise awareness, and we will still put things into perspective. I can see some French people on the site starting to get tense. No, everything is fine. First of all, the purpose of this report is to provide information, but it's important to know that not all ticks are infested, fortunately. So, just because you have been bitten by a tick does not necessarily mean you will catch Lyme disease. So first, it certainly depends on the species of the tick. It also definitely depends on the stage of its development. The larva is indeed unlikely to infect you unless it has been contaminated by its mother. So the mother's eggs can also carry the disease, but this is much rarer. And the larva has not yet eaten, so it must have had at least one meal for it to be contaminated. So the nymph, which has already been able to feed, presents a slightly higher risk. And in fact, the highest risk is the adult tick, because it reaches this stage in its life cycle after having had 3 full meals. During the 3rd meal, the female may even reproduce on the host with the male, and this is her last meal. She will then lay eggs, and there is a whole cycle of egg maturation before they become larvae, and so on. So, what you need to know is that the smaller the tick, if you have small ticks of about 2 to 3 millimeters, they are in the larval stage, and you can identify them by the number of legs. They have 6 legs. Next, when we move on to the lymph, it is a little larger, so we move up a size, we move to 8 legs, the shell hardens, and this is simply the adult size, where we have a tick that can really be seen with the naked eye, that you can't miss with the naked eye, and here we are probably looking at an adult size, so you can already make these first attacks. The risk of developing figures, what the statistics tell us about the risks of contracting this disease, the risk of contracting Lyme disease after a bite from infected ticks, is about 14%. So first of all, not all ticks are infested. Then, if I am heavily infested, there are 86% of people who, despite the tick being infested, will not contract the disease. Why? Because they have sufficient immunity to compensate. So there are simply approximately 14%, of people who are likely to catch this disease are at risk. The good news is coming, also the subject of this report, prevention, as the core of my profession. Better to prevent than to cure. If the tick is removed within the first 24 hours, that is a maximum possible of 1 day later, there is hardly a 2% risk of contracting the disease. Some say approximately 2 to 3 days. As a precaution, I prefer to limit myself to 24 hours. What does that mean exactly? We will come back to the actions to be taken. This simply means that whenever we go for a walk in the forest, and I myself am indeed a hiker and truly love being in nature, we should not deprive ourselves of this incredible pleasure and the extremely beneficial space for our physical and mental health that comes from being in contact with natural elements, even at the very risk of being contaminated by a tick. So that same evening, when I get home, if I do a thorough inspection or have a thorough inspection done by a partner, at that moment, if it is removed, it hasn't had time to regurgitate the bacteria Borrelia, and therefore, at that moment, there is almost no chance of catching Lyme disease. We will see that there are still other actions to take and put in place. So, regarding the symptoms, we will see that they are various and multiple. What you need to understand is that the symptomatology is linked to the bacteria. We will see more than 30 types, but it is key to know any infectious disease always has an incubation period. And the incubation period for Lyme disease can potentially range from a few days to several years. And that is a real problem, because it means that we might not necessarily make a connection between a tick bite, possibly with an erythema migrans, where we will see the famous reddish spot that develops at the bite site and can migrate, meaning it moves according to the parasite and the contamination, which gives us a pattern. Well, when there is that, we know contamination is almost certain. Contamination does not necessarily mean we will develop the disease. If the immune system does its job, we can slip through the cracks. But be careful. As soon as there is contamination, in my opinion, there is a need for treatment, whether medicinal or through phytotherapy, aromatherapy. But in any case, this is what I offer to my patients and also for my family, since we have been personally affected. So this is what we do systematically. What you need to know is that spirochetes are parasites in the form of bacteria with a small tail. These microorganisms are similar to well-known bacteria that caused many diseases in the last century. Their unique structure has drawn attention due to their resemblance to other pathogenic bacteria from past decades. Well, these spirochetes can migrate to different organs. That means some have a preference for the joint system, others for cartilage, others for the neurological system, and even other organs, which means it will result in very different symptoms. So what symptoms can we look for that might indicate to us whether, hey, am I potentially developing Lyme disease? It can potentially manifest as headaches. The problem here is that headaches are multifactorial. There are many reasons to have headaches other than a mental obsession. So it's not sufficient. One can have high-level neurological impairments, such as hearing loss and the onset of facial paralysis. Here we immediately think of a trophism, an escherichia infection that will rather target the neurological system. So this is quite rare, but in any case, it exists. Some can also attack the heart and cause cardiovascular complications. It is quite rare, but it does exist. The most common symptoms you will find are muscle pain, chilliness, and fatigue. These are signs you should take into account seriously, because these are also called cold infections, so the body is reacting, causing chills like with the flu, but if you take your temperature, you don't have a fever, or if you do have a fever, it is very mild, around 37.5, 38 degrees C. These are signs to take into account. The most important sign to consider, as I mentioned earlier, but I will revisit it, is the famous erythema migrans, which is this bullseye rash. And having seen several, it is unmistakable. It appears as a large patch at the site of the tick bite, and at that moment, this patch or erythema will move and shift depending on the parasitism. So if there is this erythema, and in addition there are chills, fevers, a febrile state, then we can be sure that we are definitely infected. And so, as I mentioned earlier, treatment necessarily requires a medical consultation. I advise you in any case, ideally, to seek out doctors who have appropriate training for this. There are networks for this, but also allopathic treatment and or phytoaromatherapy. Another sign that can also be found is indeed very joint-related symptoms, which are quite common in ticks that live in our regions in Europe, and it will result in a kind of arthritis. So it can be localized to a joint, it can be localized to the hip, shoulder, wrists, and often it causes swelling. And at that point, there is often confusion. That is to say, it can indeed be mistaken for precisely an arthritic disease. And we will see that it is indeed also called the great mimic or the great imitator, this very famous Lyme disease. Other signs that can also be found include ocular issues and digestive problems, but there you have it. We have indeed just described the very most important ones. So this first phase will last approximately from the moment of what we call the primary phase, that is, from the moment there is a tick bite that has injected these famous Borrelia, these famous bacteria carrying Lyme disease. Generally, following the bite, within the next 30 days, between 20 and 30 days, at that moment, there is erythema, and it is estimated that in 60% of cases, there is erythema migrans. So it's not, once again, we can go beyond 40%, meaning we can be infected without the erythema. But when there is erythema, there is contamination. That's the main thing to remember. After this primary phase we talked about, which is the contamination, there is what we call a secondary phase. It depends on whether the immune system was sufficient or not. So in the primary phase, if the immune system is sufficient, nothing happens. There is treatment. Maybe it can be sufficient or not, and indeed perhaps nothing happens. And the second possibility is entering a secondary phase, meaning that if the immune system is insufficient, a few weeks or months after the bite, there can be manifestations in the areas I mentioned to you, that is in the joints, the nervous system, the heart, or even the eyes. And this results in inflammation, meaning there are pains, redness, and joint issues. This is what we call the secondary phase. Generally, this is indeed when patients consult because there are many signs of discomfort, pain, etc. And that is where, in general, in most cases, the diagnosis can eventually be made. Unfortunately, if the diagnosis is not made, the doctor is not trained, and the patient waits before consulting, one can enter the third phase, known as the tertiary phase, also called chronic Lyme, and this can appear months or even years later. I have a family case, a person who developed the disease perhaps about 10 years ago. And by saying, well, it's not serious, well, yes, but it's not actually serious. And if the damage was actually happening silently, and unfortunately the damage was very significant. So here we can have dermatological manifestations, rare in France, more commonly chronic arthritis, which can even be mistaken for polyarthritis, or even neurological damage that can resemble multiple sclerosis. And we will see that there are many common points. That's why it is called the great mimic, meaning it can even mimic clinical signs of multiple sclerosis, and other conditions can even affect the nervous system and present as stages, like a state of depression. So these are the various different stages. It can transmit numerous different types of pathogens. Of course, there is the famous parasitic bacterium I mentioned, but the problem is that the tick, this syringe of pathogens, can also carry other pathogens such as babesiosis, bartonellosis, Q fever, tick-borne encephalitis, or rickettsiosis. So these are somewhat technical terms, forgive me, but to say that there is one, it's babiosis. It's the famous cat scratch disease. Well, actually, there can be co-infections. This is important to know because it explains why some people develop relatively mild Lyme disease with pain and redness, which are not very comfortable, but others end up with many symptoms. And very often, it's because there are, and this is super important, we will talk about it, to know which test to do to see through what we have been affected. So just a few words to talk about babesiosis. It is an infection with a protozoan called Babesia, and it can be asymptomatic, but it can lead to diseases that resemble malaria, such as anemic, hemolytic fevers, and therefore it is very serious. One can also have Bartonellosis, as I mentioned earlier, which is the famous cat scratch disease. It is not very serious, but it can be quite uncomfortable. And then there is this famous arthritis of Lyme disease, which strangely resembles polyarthritis, because in fact the parasite, the bacteria, attacks the collagen in the joints. At that moment it creates inflammation, and the symptoms are very close to those of arthritis. So think about this as well, especially if there were signs beforehand. What you need to know, and it's important to know, is that if there were already infections before Lyme disease, you are much more vulnerable in terms of immunity. Imagine a disease that is quite harmless yet quite debilitating, which is candidiasis. Candida albicans, which is a type of mold, causes the well-known infection called candidiasis that can affect the genital organs and can also affect other parts of the body. I am going down. Warm and humid areas, such as athlete's foot, which is an interdigital fungal infection between the toes, among others, or a genital fungal infection, well, the immune system is already weakened, and therefore there is a higher chance that Lyme disease will develop. Someone who has been in contact with cytomegalovirus, also known as the kissing disease, is significantly weakened immunologically. In any case, it is more likely to slip through the immune system's net, the disease of the soul. Or simply, someone who is prone to herpes, whether labial or vaginal, it's the same, it's all these other possible contaminations. Increase the risks. So the goal is not to scare you, but rather to raise your awareness if you are affected, whether you carry the herpes virus or cytomegalovirus. More caution, more prudence, even more than others, if you are affected by a tick bite and have this migrating erythema, and possibly the feverish state we talked about, and be extra cautious and vigilant. So I would like to quote a great man, a great specialist in Lyme disease. I believe he's originally from Belgium, but he has been living in the United States for a very long time. He did his internship there. His name is Richard Horowitz. We will include the documents in the bonus section, as well as his book, which is very interesting to read and study, because as a great specialist on the subject, he indeed has a lot to offer us. Well, what Horowitz says is that, in fact, people who are malnourished or have a highly processed diet, therefore deficient in vitamins, minerals, trace elements, and enzymes, are more likely to develop Lyme disease. So this interests us as terrain therapists, as holistic naturopaths, where we really take a comprehensive approach to the terrain. Well, basically, it means that the more I take care of my health, the better my lifestyle habits are, starting with nutrition, and we will also look at stress management. Ultimately, which makes sense, the better my terrain will be able to do its job and fight against the potential contamination of this bacterium. So, I would like to explain why Lyme disease is also difficult to treat, and that simply giving antibiotics, as proposed by allopathic medicine, which is not heresy, but is not sufficient because, in fact, Lyme disease, in order to establish itself, or in any case the bacteria, in order to establish themselves and live at the expense of their host, have developed adaptation strategies. They too need to live. And so, in their adaptation strategy, they have developed a way to remain parasitic to the host in a sustainable manner, which is called the biofilm. The biofilm is a community life. The bacteria live in a community and protect themselves of the immune system. One could say schematically, it's as if they essentially set up a protective net, making them almost invisible or difficult to reach by the immune system. And there, they can live in a dormant state for many years, effectively. and then wake up due to a failure of the immune system, or someone who is tired, immunocompromised, or gets infected by another germ, such as candidiasis or herpes, to take these examples. And at that moment, it will wake up and have the possibility to express itself, and that's when the disease occurs. So the good news, and once again, I will put the links in the detailed bonus section of the comprehensive report, we have natural methods to break down these biofilms. And this is very important to know because antibiotics become ineffective or not sufficiently effective if we haven't first taken care of breaking down the biofilm. So how do we do it? Well, we have two substances. One is called serrapeptase. Now, serrapeptase is extremely interesting. It is a proteolytic enzyme, meaning it breaks down proteins, including the proteins that make up this protection. And it is produced by the Serratia, a microorganism which resides in the digestive system of the silkworm and is responsible for producing a specific substance through the silk glass, which it uses to break out of its cocoon. And you see that the metaphor is indeed fascinating. We are going to use this same molecule to break the burfine. So you will see in the links there are several laboratories that offer it. I will give the address of one I work with, but you can find others, of course. Afterwards, what you need to know is which molecule to use. So that will be the first thing to do. As soon as you know you've been contaminated, whether you have the migratory rash, clinical signs, or even just a doubt, well, even if you consult a doctor who gives you antibiotics, the first thing to do is to use peptides to break down the biofilm. And it does not oppose antibiotics or aromatherapy. On the contrary, it makes them much more effective. So this is the first option we have, which is serrapeptase. We have an additional second molecule that can use another substance. It's called lactoferrin. So honestly, when I have a patient who is concerned about the topic, and I have treated quite a few, I give both. I prefer suspenders and parachutes. If I had to choose just one, I'd take serrapeptase. But the significant advantage of lactoferrin is that it also has an important role on biofilms. And crucially, it blocks a number of possibilities for bacterial multiplication by depriving them of a tool they use to grow, which is iron, thus effectively blocking this possibility. So lactoferrin, the second option, either instead of the first, for example, serrapeptase for the biofilm, or as a complement. And we also have, on the side of aromatherapy, the possibility of using an essential oil that is well documented for its ability to break down biofilm. I should clarify that biofilm does not exist only in Lyme disease. Biofilms are also commonly found in microbial bacteria and in fungal diseases. So the candidiasis I mentioned earlier also works in this form of biofilm, in fact, as well. So it's interesting to know the natural weapons we have to break down this biofilm even before resorting to antibiotics or anti-infection treatments. So here we have an American who has worked a lot on this, named James Scheller. Well, he says that the best anti-glyphine remedy in case of Lyme borreliosis is eugenol. Eugenol is a molecule that can be found in clove or in the leaf of the cinnamon tree, for example. It's quite interesting to explore and make use of this possibility as well. So now let's talk a little bit about the tests. Regarding the tests, I have a suspicion of malignancy, or I have been bitten, or I don't remember, I don't even know. Maybe I was bitten so long ago that I forgot. I have some symptoms, I consult my doctor, and then the doctor will suggest you take a test called ELISA. The problem is it's the official test, and if this test is negative, that's where it ends. If the test is positive, he will suggest you take an additional test called the Western blot. These are indeed the two tests that exist in France in any case. The problem, and this is what I was warning you about, is saying that these tests are not reliable. If it is positive, there's a chance that it is true, but there are plenty of false negatives. Let's discuss the first. ELISA, first of all, it is ineffective if you haven't waited at least 2 to 8 weeks after the tick bite, so after the inoculation. Why? Because there aren't enough antibodies, so it won't detect them. We have plenty of false negatives, but we also have plenty of false positives. You might think you have Lyme disease, but in fact you don't. So for me, the most reliable remains the clinic. Now, in France, there is ELISA. The doctor will request to do a Western blot. So it is more sensitive, more effective, so it's definitely better to have both anyway, except that if the first one is negative and it's a false negative, you won't be entitled to the Western blot unless you pay for it out of your own pocket, which I advise you to do in any case, but it too can have false negatives and false positives. What the specialists tell us, among others, I speak under the authority of Christian Perron, who has been the leading specialist as an infectious disease expert at Medline. He was one of the whistleblowers explaining that doctors were not trained, that patients were left in medical limbo, and that things were not being taken seriously enough. He talked about PCR tests, which we will see are indeed the most effective way to diagnose it. In the background, by saying that ultimately none of the methods, speaking of ELISA and Western blot, is sufficiently effective, sufficiently sensitive to be considered reliable, particularly in routine practice. So that means that today it is not enough. Additionally, it is very important to know that these tests were specifically developed in relation to Borrelia bordifori, in homage to Willy Bordifer, whom I mentioned earlier, meaning the predominant bacteria. But it is predominant, it is not unique, meaning it is present at 60% in Europe, while there are about 10 other strains that exist. And so one can slip through the cracks. If the antibodies are not in sufficient quantity to be detected, or if the test is done too early, the patient can indeed end up with a test that is unfortunately negative, while in reality he is still carrying the disease. We also have false positives, lumberjacks, among others, or people who are regularly exposed to tick bites for professional reasons, end up with many false positives, meaning they have many antibodies. But because the immune system has developed the antibodies, they will not develop the disease. So to summarize, we can say that for now, the most reliable test is essentially the PCR, which means high throughput sequencing. These are much more recent tests, but in any case, they are not reimbursed. For that, you need to look towards Switzerland or Germany if you really want to have that certainty. Now, there is another way, and I will once again put the link in the bonuses. It is to complete a medical questionnaire that was established by the Lyme disease specialist Richard Horowitz, whom I mentioned earlier. He developed a symptomatic questionnaire for what he calls chronic Lyme diseases, which allows you to see if you are affected by it. He calls it MSIDS, which stands for Multiple Systemic Infectious Disease Syndrome, or Lyme disease, in both cases. And so this allows for a relatively reliable questionnaire. I have had the opportunity to test it on several occasions. And in any case, before the tests, definitely do this first. And if you have a positive result on the questionnaire, just buy Richard Horowitz's book. Maybe it is online. I haven't checked. You can check it. But anyway, the book is really worth it. It is a very good complement to this report to complete. So these are the diagnostic methods. Now, what can we do about it? So regarding that, now we will look at the possible solutions. So from a solution perspective, common sense tells me that it is better to prevent than to cure. So there are many things to do in primary prophylaxis, that is prevention. First, use light-colored covering clothing. Because the tick is black, you will see them much more easily. Always have a tick remover with you, those small crowbar-like tools you can find. There are two sizes, and it's well designed because the smaller one corresponds to the larval stage, meaning tiny creatures that are less than a millimeter, barely visible to the naked eye, and you can't remove them without this tick remover. With tweezers, the risk is breaking the rostrum and leaving it inside, which can lead to an infection due to having a foreign body in the body. So, tick removers, we always have them with us, either when we go hiking or always at home, and they are very easy to find in pharmacies. Secondly, we can use repellents. So there are allopathic repellents which are sold in pharmacies, and I will let you find out what you can get. You can also use essential oil-based repellents. You just need 2-3% of clove essential oil, for example, which is a very good repellent, diluted in alcohol because it doesn't dissolve in water, make a kind of spray, and you can use that. The idea in prevention is also to stay on the paths. You should know that when you venture out into the undergrowth where the grass is very tall and shrubs are present, that's exactly where ticks latch on, and that's where you are more likely to catch them. And be careful, ladies, when you go to relieve yourselves, when you squat, it is also at that moment, it has happened regularly, that people find themselves contaminated on their thighs or buttocks. The most important thing for me, as I mentioned earlier, is to conduct a thorough and detailed inspection after each outing in nature, especially during the periods when ticks begin to appear, which is roughly from the month of May until the autumn season. These are the specific times in their life cycle when they are present and start looking for a snack through the blood of their victims. And finally, the last piece of advice from a prophylactic point of view is to carry or have at home a small bottle of tea tree essential oil. Tea tree is indeed a very interesting essential oil because it contains a very powerful terpenic alcohol, highly anti-infectious, which acts on many germs. And so as a preventive measure, as soon as there is a bite, remove the tick with the famous tick remover and immediately apply 1 or 2 drops too on the bite, then monitor for signs to see if there are any clinical symptoms. So, to summarize, in general, wear light-colored clothing, avoid walking in areas with tall grass, stay on the paths, perform a thoroughly detailed inspection after going out, and use tea tree essential oil immediately if there is a bite. These are the most important aspects. Now, once we've done that, if there is contamination, we need to look at the treatments. So here, Horowitz speaks as a doctor about the antibiotics that are used. This is the doctor's responsibility. Your doctor will give you the proper care. I'll discuss what can be done in natural medicine, like phytotherapy and aromatherapy. And what you need to know is that in both cases, whether it's on the side of allopathy, antibiotics, or on the side of aromatherapy, even phytotherapy, you should know that there is a high probability that if you are infected when you take a treatment, whether it is antibiotics or aromaphyto, you will experience a worsening of symptoms, which is known as the famous Herx or Herxmeyer reaction. So that's not serious, you just need to adjust the treatment, but it means that you are infected and that the treatment is working. So it's actually good news in this context. From a naturopathy perspective, what are we going to propose? First of all, logically, it would be to have a body that is as detoxified as possible, because as we saw earlier, and as Richard Horowitz points out, the more polluted and intoxicated we are, the higher the risk of being contaminated. So having a diet that is as plant-based as possible, as natural as possible, and as unprocessed as possible is already important. If there are clinical signs related to the disease, in that case we will rather focus on an anti-inflammatory diet. Because as we have already seen, the Borrelia will develop inflammation to live at the expense of its host, and so we should aim to minimize foods that fuel inflammation as much as possible. In simple terms, dairy products. Schematically, sugars to eliminate, alcohol, so those are the priorities. Then we can act, if necessary, on the cofactors. Imagine you have a candidiasis or herpes, you need to treat that as well to avoid signs of worsening. If you are in a deficient state, you are not eating enough fruits and vegetables, then in that case, it makes sense to take dietary supplements with antioxidants, vitamin C, vitamin D, and minerals. So that is extremely important. Next, we need to act on the biofilm, so serrapeptase or lactoferrin, as we have seen previously. It is also important to take care of your gut. Therefore, it is extremely important, if there are signs, to take quality probiotics to strengthen your immunity. And immunity starts with the intestinal barrier, which is extremely important. So this is important. And then, that's not all. We will definitely need to support the immune system. So here we have a number of plants that have been studied by science. Among other things, a study conducted in 2020 by a team of researchers in microbiology and immunology at Johns Hopkins University showed which plants worked and which did not. I want to talk about the ones that work, especially those with which I have experience. So among those that have at least equivalent effectiveness to antibiotics, we have Cryptolepis sanguinolenta, which is a plant that is known to be effective and has been studied extensively and works. I am not specifically talking about it as I don't have much experience in the field, but knowing that we already have plants that work as well as, or even better than, antibiotics is quite reassuring. It shows that while nature can provide bacteria and sources of diseases, it also offers solutions. Another plant shown in this 2020 study is Juglandstregia, the black walnut, which has very good results on Borrelia. The one I will talk to you about in more detail, since I have experience with it, is Artemisia annua, also known as sweet wormwood, which works on malaria but also works on Lyme disease. And there I have successfully treated dozens of people for this, along with other things, not just Artemisia, but in my experience it works very, very well and effectively. In the bonus section, I'll give you an address to source your supplies, because if you grow the plant at home, that's good, but it needs to correspond to a biotope to develop the molecules, including artemisinin, concentrated enough to have therapeutic efficacy. Here we are not talking about a recreational drink or an infusion, we mean phytotherapy. We have cat's claw, which gives very good results, and among others, this is how it is. It is the phytotherapy used by Horowitz, and Scutellaria, or Chinese skullcap, which also gives very good results. So personally, in my professional opinion, the first thing I strongly recommend to my patients is when they show clinical signs of Lyme disease, or simply when there has been this MITM, this migrant heritage, forgive me, is to use Artemisia tea. It is an ancestral treatment against malaria. It best supports the immune system and also has a significant anti-parasitic effect. So this is indeed extremely interesting. So you will definitely look into how to source it if you wish to use my sourcing in any case. The Horowitz protocol, on the other hand, uses the famous cat's claw, and there is a laboratory called Nutramedix. I will also provide the links which offers this medicine, or rather this medicinal plant called Samento, because it is a hydroalcoholic extract in which the active principles of cat's claw are concentrated. So what Horowitz says, and I speak based on his experience, is that we have a product that is definitely more effective than taking capsules or cat's claw capsules. So that's interesting. And the second plant that Horowitz uses is banderol, also found from the same manufacturer, Nutramedix, which is a highly respected American laboratory, but it can also be found on their website, exported to Germany. It is a hydroalcoholic extract of the Autobats tree bark. And the combination of the two allows for incredibly interesting effectiveness. He suggests doing this treatment for 2 months, then switching to antibiotics. I won't discuss antibiotics, as it's not my field of expertise. So it's up to you whether to stop there or, for safety, proceed with antibiotics. This should be discussed and agreed upon with your doctor. So what Horowitz tells us, very important, is that Borrelia bordiflori has a lifespan that can range from several weeks to 6 to 8 months. So undergoing treatment for Lyme disease to address Lyme disease means not stopping after 2 months. You can take a break, but you need to repeat it at least 2 months, 2 to 3 months later, do it a second time, maybe even a third time. And as a precaution, when there are really a lot of symptoms, I do 2 or 3 protocols. Artemisia annua, Samento plus banderol, we do this for 2 months, take a break, and start again 2 months later, take a 2-month break, and possibly even a third time. So it is definitely extremely important to know this. And then we have aromatherapy. So I won't go into detail here because it wouldn't be very friendly in a video, but I will include it in the protocol dossier developed by Dominique Baudou, who is a great expert in aromatherapy, with whom I have collaborated extensively and with whom I am still in contact. So here, with their consent, I am safely sharing these formulas in aromatherapy to first treat the tick bite. So we can use only tea tree oil, which is the minimum, but if we want to create a more elaborate formula, we can have a more sophisticated disinfection blend for the bite, in which we will combine complementary anti-infectious molecules, such as Chinese cinnamon and clove, thus 2 major anti-infectious families. And then, in the detailed report, I propose an oral treatment. These are classic protocols, but it is indeed true that I also advise you to have follow-up with a naturopath trained in aromatherapy or a doctor trained in aromatherapy, because the formulas I give you are somewhat general in nature, but often we have to adjust the dosage based on the patient's reactions. In any case, I have used this formula with very good results, but we often had to reduce the quantity because the person, depending on their sensitivity, could not tolerate it. We are dealing with strong treatments. So here I am giving you the formulas. You will see Chilean cinnamon, oregano, thyme, atimol, and palmarosa. And we can also definitely provide complementary treatments in cases where the PCR shows there have been co-infections such as babesiosis or bartonellosis. So I will include that as well. And what is interesting to do is also to undertake a quarterly detox that is indeed to help the liver better tolerate aromatherapy and phytotherapy. There you go. I won't go into more detail because the rest is in your report. I hope this report has helped shed light on a topic that is not well known to the general public and even the medical world, to be clear. It will give you hope if, unfortunately, you or a loved one or someone close to you is affected. And don't hesitate to consult specialized therapists, but here you already have what you need for prevention and treatment. Most importantly, keep hope. The priority, and this will be the final word, is that the healthier your condition, the less likely you are to develop malignancy. Thank you for listening and see you soon for the live session.